My name is Thomas Brennan. I am 45 years old, and I work as a wilderness ranger for Redwood National Park in Northern California. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been with the National Park Service for 21 years, spending the last 13 here in the Redwoods. These are the tallest trees on Earth, some reaching over 380 feet high, creating forests so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground even at noon. The park protects old-growth redwood groves that have stood for over 2,000 years, and the atmosphere inside these forests is different from anywhere else I've worked. It is darker, quieter, more primordial. Fog rolls in constantly from the Pacific Ocean, just miles away, reducing visibility to almost nothing and creating an environment that feels prehistoric. This happened last October during our rainy season, when tourist numbers drop significantly, and much of the park empties out. I was on a solo patrol of the Tall Trees Grove, one of the most remote areas of the park, accessible only by a rough dirt road that requires a special access code, then a steep 4-mile hike down into a canyon. The grove contains some of the tallest trees in the world, including several that are over 360 feet tall and 20 feet in diameter. It is an incredible place, but also deeply isolated. On this particular day, I hadn't seen another person in over 8 hours. I was hiking through the grove around 3 p.m., checking trail conditions after recent heavy rains, when I noticed something carved into the bark of a massive redwood. These trees have very thick bark, sometimes a foot deep, soft, and fibrous. What I saw was a series of deep cuts forming symbols or patterns I didn't recognize. They were fresh, the exposed wood inside still light-colored, probably made within the last day or two. The cuts were high up, starting about 7 feet off the ground and extending up to maybe 9 feet, well above where a normal person could reach without tools or a ladder. I photographed the markings and continued my patrol. Over the next hour, I found similar carvings on 5 more trees, all massive, old-growth redwoods, all at that same impossible height. The patterns were similar, but not identical, like someone was practicing or refining a design. I documented each one carefully, noting GPS coordinates and taking detailed photos. Around 4 p.m., the fog started rolling in thick. Within 20 minutes, visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet. The already dark forest became darker. The massive trees just vague shapes in the gray mist. I decided to head back, not wanting to hike out in heavy fog. But as I turned around, I heard something that made me stop cold. Wood knocking. 2 loud, deliberate knocks on wood, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere in the fog ahead of me. I stood frozen, listening. Then 2 more knocks, same rhythm, from a different direction off to my right, then 2 more from behind me. I was being triangulated by something making deliberate sounds from multiple positions. I called out loudly, identifying myself as a park ranger, asking if anyone was there. No response. Then I heard movement in the fog, something large pushing through ferns and undergrowth, moving fast, not running exactly, but covering ground quickly. The sound circled around me, staying just out of sight in the fog, maintaining maybe a 50-foot distance. I started walking toward the trailhead, moving at a quick pace. The sounds kept pace with me, whatever it was, matching my speed, staying parallel to my route. Every few minutes, more wood knocking, always from different directions. Then I heard something else. A vocalization, starting low and rising to a high-pitched scream, echoing through the fog-shrouded forest. Not human, not any animal I recognized from 21 years of ranger work. I picked up my pace to almost a jog, difficult on the rough trail. The sound stayed with me, sometimes seeming closer, sometimes farther, but always there. This continued for over 3 miles. Then, as I climbed out of the canyon and reached the dirt road where my truck was parked, the sound stopped. Complete silence except for fog dripping from trees. I got in my truck and sat there for several minutes, adrenaline fading, trying to process what had happened. Then I noticed something, large muddy prints on the hood of my truck. Barefoot human-shaped prints, but massive, easily 17 or 18 inches long. Something had walked across the hood of my truck while I was down in the canyon. I photographed the prints, then drove straight to park headquarters. I filed a detailed report, including all my photos of the tree carvings, GPS coordinates, and description of what I'd experienced. The response was mixed. My supervisor took it seriously, but the official position was likely vagrant campers, or maybe someone on drugs behaving erratically. The tree carvings were noted but attributed to vandalism. But an older ranger, a man who'd worked in the Redwoods for over 30 years, pulled me aside privately. He said the Yurok and Tolowa people, whose ancestral territory includes this area, have extensive traditional knowledge about beings they call by various names, meaning the giants of the forest or the old ones. According to their teachings, these beings have lived in the deepest redwood groves since long before humans arrived. They're extremely tall and powerful, and they mark their territory by carving symbols on trees at heights humans can't reach. The wood knocking is communication between them, and they'll follow people to make sure they leave the grove. He showed me a file of incident reports going back decades. Different rangers, different times, but similar experiences in that same area of the park. Tree carvings at impossible heights, wood knocking sounds, being followed in fog, strange vocalizations. None of it officially acknowledged, all filed away as unexplained incidents. What disturbed me most was looking through those old reports and seeing the pattern. The incidents always happened in the deepest, most isolated groves, always in fog or low visibility, and the rangers who reported them, almost all of them, eventually transferred to other parks or left the service entirely. One report from 1987 described almost exactly what I'd experienced, down to the triangulated wood, knocking and the screaming vocalization. That ranger quit 3 weeks later. I went back to Tall Trees Grove 2 weeks after my encounter, this time with a partner and in clear weather. We found the trees I'd documented with the carvings, but there were new ones. Fresh cuts on 3 additional trees, all at the same impossible height, all in areas I'd walked through. It was as if whatever made them was showing me they'd been watching my route, marking where I'd been. I still work in the Redwoods because I love these forests, despite what happened. But I won't patrol Tall Trees Grove alone anymore, especially not in fog. And when I hear wood knocking in the forest, I leave immediately, because I know now that the deepest groves aren't empty. Something lives there that has been there far longer than the park has existed. Something that marks its territory and makes sure visitors know they're being watched, and that they're not welcome to stay. The redwood forests of Northern California contain over 130,000 acres of old growth. Trees so massive and dense, they create their own climate. Most visitors stay on developed trails near parking areas. The deep groves, accessible only by difficult hikes, rarely see humans. Perfect habitat for something that wants to remain unknown. And based on what I experienced and the files I've seen, something does live in those groves. Something tall enough to carve symbols 9 feet up on tree trunks. Something that communicates through wood knocking and coordinates movements to follow people. Something that has been documented consistently by rangers for decades, but never officially acknowledged. My name is Robert Martinez. I am 52 years old, and I've been driving logging trucks in Humboldt County, California, for 28 years. I haul logs from timber operations in the coastal mountains down to mills near the coast, driving routes through some of the most remote forest country in the state. This happened last winter on Highway 36, a narrow twisting mountain road that cuts through dense forest between the coast and the interior. It is a dangerous road, lots of curves, steep grades, and in winter it is often wet and foggy. I was driving eastbound around 2 a.m. with an empty truck, heading back to a logging site to pick up my first load of the day. The road was empty. No other traffic. Heavy fog reducing visibility to maybe 100 feet. Around mile marker 47, in one of the most remote sections, my headlights caught something standing in the road ahead. I slowed down, assuming it was a deer or elk, common on this road at night. But as I got closer, I realized it was much larger than any deer. and it was standing upright on two legs in the middle of my lane. I hit the brakes hard, the truck shuddering to a stop, maybe 30 feet from this thing. It was massive. At least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur, with a body structure that was wrong for any animal I knew. Too upright. Too human, like in posture, but way too large. It stood there facing my truck, lit up by my headlights, not moving. We stared at each other for maybe 10 seconds. Then it did something that terrified me. It walked toward my truck. Not aggressive or charging, just walking deliberately toward me, closing the distance. I sat frozen, hands on the wheel, watching it approach. It walked right up to the front of my truck, maybe 5 feet from my windshield, and stopped. This close, I could see details. The face was ape-like, but not quite right. More human features mixed in. The eyes were dark and intelligent, focused directly on me through the windshield. The size was overwhelming. This thing could easily look down into my elevated truck cab. It stood there for maybe 20 seconds, just staring at me, breath visible in the cold air. Then it raised one massive arm and placed a hand on the hood of my truck. I could hear the metal flex under the weight. It pressed down, and I felt my truck shift, the front suspension compressing. This thing was pushing down on my truck with enough force to move it. Then it lifted its hand, stepped back, turned, and walked off the road into the forest. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the fog and darkness. I sat there shaking, engine still running, trying to understand what had just happened. Then I noticed my radio was going crazy, static and weird sounds, even though it had been working fine seconds before. I grabbed my CB radio to call my dispatcher and report this, but it was dead, wouldn't transmit. My cell phone showed no signal, which was normal for this area. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, torn between driving forward past where it had gone into the woods, or turning around and going back. Finally, I decided to continue. I had a job to do, and turning around meant driving back through 47 miles of empty mountain road. I drove forward slowly, watching the forest on both sides, expecting it to come back out. For the next 10 miles, maybe 20 minutes of driving, I kept seeing movement in the fog just at the edge of my headlight range, shapes keeping pace with my truck, running through the forest parallel to the road. Several times, I clearly saw a large upright figure crossing the road behind me in my mirrors. There 1 second, gone the next. I didn't stop, just kept driving, white-knuckling the wheel. Finally, the forest opened up, and I reached the logging site. There were other drivers there, other trucks, lights, people. I'd never been so relieved to see other humans. I told them what happened, being careful about how I described it. A couple of the older drivers nodded, like they'd heard similar stories. One driver said Highway 36 has a reputation, especially that section around mile 47. Drivers have reported seeing large figures on the road at night for decades. That morning, after I loaded my truck and headed back down the mountain in daylight, I stopped at mile marker 47. I got out and examined the road where it had stood. The pavement was wet from fog, and I found prints. Massive barefoot prints, clear in the wet road surface, right where it had been standing. I photographed them with my phone next to my boot for scale. The prints were at least twice the size of my size, 11 boot. I also checked the hood of my truck where it had pressed down. There was a clear handprint in the morning dew, huge, with 5 distinct fingers. I photographed that too before the sun burned off the dew. I reported it to the California Highway Patrol. They took a report, but clearly thought I'd imagined it or was exhausted from night driving. They said bears sometimes stand on roads, even though I explained in detail why this wasn't a bear. They filed it as wildlife encounter, and that was it. But I talked to other logging truck drivers, guys I've worked with for years. Several admitted privately they'd had experiences on Highway 36, seeing large figures crossing the road at night, being paced through the forest by something running parallel to their trucks, finding handprints or footprints near their trucks when they stop. They don't report it because nobody takes it seriously and it sounds crazy. But among drivers who run that route regularly, There is quiet understanding that something lives in those mountains along Highway 36. What really got to me was talking to a retired driver, a man who'd hauled logs on Highway 36 for 35 years before retiring in 2015. He told me that back in the 1990s, there was a serious discussion among logging companies about not running that route at night anymore, because too many drivers were having encounters and refusing to drive it. But the financial pressure was too great. They needed round-the-clock operations. So they just stopped talking about it officially and left it up to individual drivers whether to accept night runs. He showed me a journal he'd kept, documenting every strange thing he'd seen or experienced on Highway 36 over his career. Dozens of entries spanning decades, figures on the road, sounds from the forest, handprints on trucks, equipment malfunctions in specific locations. He said he kept it because he wanted a record, proof that he wasn't crazy, that this was real and consistent. The Hoopa Valley tribe, whose reservation is in this area, has traditional knowledge about beings they describe as forest giants or wild men. According to their teachings, these beings live in the most remote and dense parts of the coastal mountains. They're territorial about logging roads and human activity in their areas, and they'll show themselves to lone travelers to demonstrate their presence and power. The hand on the hood of my truck wasn't aggressive. It was a demonstration, showing me it could flip my truck if it wanted to, but choosing not to. I still drive logging trucks on Highway 36. It is part of my regular route and my job, but I don't drive it at night anymore if I can possibly avoid it. I schedule my runs for daylight hours, and if I have to drive it at night, I drive fast through that section around mile 40. 7. Don't stop for anything, and I keep my doors locked, even though I am not sure what good that would do against something that size and strength. The coastal mountains of Humboldt County contain hundreds of thousands of acres of dense forest, much of it old-growth redwood and Douglas fir. Logging roads penetrate some areas, but vast sections are roadless wilderness, perfect habitat for large animals that want to avoid humans. And based on what I experienced in conversations with other drivers who've had similar encounters, something does live in those mountains. Something tall enough and strong enough to push down the front of a loaded logging truck. Something that shows itself to lone drivers on remote roads and makes sure they know who really owns these forests. My name is James Chen. I am 36 years old, and I am an experienced backpacker who has hiked trails all over the western United States. Last May, I attempted to hike the Lost Coast Trail in Northern California, which is considered one of the most remote and challenging coastal hikes in the country. The Lost Coast Trail runs for about 53 miles along California's rugged northwest coast, through an area so steep and wild that Highway 1 had to route inland, leaving this section of coastline undeveloped and isolated. The trail crosses beaches, climbs over rocky headlands, and passes through dense coastal forest. There are no towns, no roads, no facilities for the entire length. You have to be completely self-sufficient and time your hike carefully, because parts of the trail are impassable at high tide. I planned a 4-day solo hike from south to north. I am comfortable hiking alone. I had all proper gear and supplies. I'd studied the tide charts carefully, and I'd done plenty of research. I started at the southern trailhead on a Thursday morning in late May, beautiful weather, feeling confident and excited. The first day was spectacular. Empty beaches, dramatic rock formations, sea lions on offshore rocks, incredible scenery. I saw no other hikers all day, which wasn't surprising given how remote this trail is. I camped that night on a beach, fell asleep to the sound of waves. Perfect wilderness experience. The second day started well. I hiked through the morning, made good time, stopped for lunch on a beach. Around 2 p.m., I entered a section where the trail climbs up into coastal forest to get around a headland that is impassable at the beach level. The forest was dense, mostly Sitka spruce and hemlock, very dark and quiet compared to the open beach. About a mile into the forest section, I found something strange. A large stick structure, maybe 7 feet tall, made from branches and driftwood, arranged in a teepee shape. It was clearly deliberate, too structured to be natural. I'd read about hikers finding these structures on the Lost Coast and other remote trails, usually attributed to other backpackers making shelters or art projects. But this one seemed different, more substantial, and it was in a spot where nobody would camp, no water nearby, and steep terrain. I photographed it and continued hiking. Over the next 2 miles, I found 3 more similar structures, all positioned along the trail, all about the same size and construction style. That seemed like a lot of effort for random hikers to put in. Then I noticed something else. I was being followed. I'd hear sounds behind me on the trail, branches breaking, footsteps. But whenever I stopped and looked back, nothing was visible. The forest was too dense to see far. Visibility maybe 30 or 40 feet before everything disappeared into thick vegetation and shadows. I picked up my pace, feeling increasingly uneasy. The sounds behind me picked up pace too, maintaining the same distance. This continued for maybe an hour. Then the sounds moved off the trail into the forest paralleling my route. I could hear something large pushing through brush beside the trail, keeping pace with me but staying out of sight. I stopped and yelled, "I know you are there. Show yourself or leave me alone." No response except the sounds continuing through the forest matching my position. I started hiking as fast as I could without actually running, which is difficult with a 40-pound pack on rough trail. The sounds kept pace. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A loud vocalization from the forest, starting as a low roar and rising to a high scream. Definitely not human, not any animal I recognized. The sound echoed through the forest, seemed to come from multiple directions. I did run then, pack bouncing painfully, stumbling on roots and rocks. The sounds followed, sometimes behind me, sometimes beside me in the forest, sometimes seeming to get ahead of me. I ran for maybe 20 minutes until I burst out of the forest onto an open beach. I stopped at the edge of the sand, gasping for breath, and looked back at the forest. I saw it, standing just inside the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. Massive, at least 8 feet tall, dark brown or black, covered in hair, standing upright on 2 legs watching me. We made eye contact for maybe 5 seconds. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing immediately into the dense vegetation. I didn't go back into that forest section. I checked my tide chart and map. The next forest section was about 8 miles north. I couldn't avoid it if I wanted to complete the trail. I made a decision right there. I was hiking out. I turned around and started hiking back south, retracing my route, planning to exit at the southern trailhead and abandon my through hike. I hiked until almost dark, covering maybe 12 miles back south, then camped on an open beach where I had visibility in all directions. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound had me reaching for my flashlight, expecting to see something approaching my tent. The next morning, I hiked the remaining miles back to the southern trailhead and my car. I'd never been so happy to see civilization. I reported what happened to the Bureau of Land Management, which manages the Lost Coast Trail. They took a report but suggested I'd seen a bear and misidentified it in dense forest. I didn't argue, but I know what I saw. Later, I found online forums where Lost Coast hikers share experiences. Multiple people reported similar encounters over the years. Stick structures being followed through the forest sections, hearing vocalizations that don't match known animals, seeing large upright figures. Some hikers complete the trail without issues. Others have experiences that make them leave early like I did. What disturbed me most was reading accounts going back to the early 2000s, when the Lost Coast Trail first became popular. The experiences were remarkably consistent across different years and different hikers who'd never communicated with each other. Same stick structures, same following behavior in dense forest, same vocalizations, same large upright figures. The BLM knows about these reports, but their official position is that they're all misidentified bears or fabrications. I talked to a BLM ranger off the record, someone who'd worked the Lost Coast area for over 15 years. He said privately that something unusual is going on in those coastal forests. Too many credible witnesses reporting similar experiences for it all to be bears or imagination. But there is no official investigation, no serious effort to document what is happening, because the conclusion would either be, we don't know what it is, which looks bad, or it is an unknown species, which would create management nightmares and possibly require closing areas of the trail. The Sinkyone and Mattole peoples, whose ancestral territory includes the Lost Coast, have traditional knowledge about forest beings they describe as guardians of the deep woods. According to their teachings, these beings are territorial, and they don't want humans traveling through certain areas. They'll follow people, make their presence known through sounds and signs, and occasionally show themselves to make sure the message is clear. You are not welcome here. Leave. I still backpack regularly in other areas. I haven't let this experience stop me from wilderness hiking, but I won't hike the Lost Coast Trail again, and I am much more cautious about solo hiking in dense coastal forests. Because I know now that some trails pass through territory that something else considers its own, and that something is large enough, intelligent enough, and bold enough to follow solo hikers for miles, vocalize deliberately to frighten them, and show itself briefly to make absolutely sure the hiker understands they need to leave. The Lost Coast contains some of the most remote and wild terrain in California. Over 50 miles of coastline with no roads, no development, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of acres of dense coastal forest and steep mountains. Perfect habitat for something that wants to remain hidden, but that occasionally interacts with the few humans who venture into its territory. And based on consistent reports from hikers over many years, something does live in those coastal forests. Something that builds structures, follows people, vocalizes to intimidate, and shows itself when necessary to protect its territory from intrusion.